George Abernathy squinted up at his freshly finished fence, wooden slats mismatched in grain but artfully arranged, topped with colored glass bottle ends that caught the Oregon sunlight. 5 minutes later, a crisp envelope from the Willow Creek HOA fluttered in his mailbox. He didn't move right away. The late April breeze swept through the porch, teasing the frayed hem of his flannel shirt and lifting the edges of the newspaper wedged under the doormat. Boone, his old hound, lifted his head but didn't bother to rise, just gave a soft grunt before resettling. The porch boards creaked as George stood and made his way toward the box. The pole wobbled as always, rusted near the base from seasons of rain, sun, and neighborhood beautification efforts. He pulled the envelope free and turned it in his hands, reading the embossed HOA seal with an expression somewhere between amusement and disdain. "Bet Mags'll call this one folk art for the landfill," he muttered. Boone wagged his tail once, then went back to snoozing. Back on the porch, George dropped into his rocking chair with the practiced rhythm of a man who'd done it every morning since he retired. He set his chipped mug, "Army Retired," printed in fading gold, on the side table and slid a butter knife under the envelope flap. The porch groaned in response, the same way it always had. The letter inside was brief but formal. "The fence recently constructed at 124 Maple Lane does not meet Willow Creek Homeowners Association Visual Harmony Guidelines. Non-uniform materials, excessive ornamentation, inconsistent height, and reflective surfaces violate standards outlined in Section 4B. Please remove or replace structure by May 5 to avoid daily fines of $75. George let out a dry chuckle. They wrote all that and still didn't mention how the sun hits that green glass just right around 4 o'clock. He sipped the coffee, cold by now, but he didn't mind, and gazed at the fence. It wasn't some backyard rebellion, just the latest in his series of spring projects. A mix of old barnwood, cedar scraps from Ron's garage sale, and glass bottles Lily had mailed from Portland with a note. "Thought you'd find these interesting. Love, L." He hadn't planned it to be art. It just turned out that way. He stood, knees stiff, and walked down the steps, boots thudding against the soil path he'd never bothered to pave. The fence followed the curve of his small garden, curling like a stitched seam toward the back of the property. Each slat was different, one painted with a faded sunflower, another carved faintly with a chessboard pattern. The bottle tops winked in the afternoon sun. Across the street, Ron was watering his tulips. He gave a small wave without making eye contact, and George nodded in return. Ron had once made the mistake of planting lavender too close to the sidewalk. It took Margaret less than 48 hours to issue a notice. Scent too disruptive, it had read. Back inside, the kettle whistled faintly before clicking off. George poured the hot water over a new cup of coffee grounds, letting it steep in his old enamel percolator. No drip machine for him. He'd been brewing coffee the same way since '71, and it hadn't failed him yet. He dropped a pinch of cinnamon into the pot, a habit picked up from Helen, gone nearly 9 years now but still present in the way he folded dish towels and kept a small glass bowl of buttons beside the bread box. He carried the mug back to the porch, sat down again, and tucked the HOA letter under the phone book. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint chime of wind bells from 3 houses down. Margaret had once tried to get those taken down too, claiming tonal irregularity. The board voted it down, barely. Boone rolled over with a grunt, pressing his snout against George's worn boot. George leaned over and gave him a slow scratch behind the ears. He pulled his flip phone from his shirt pocket, flipped it open with a small snap, and scrolled through the numbers until he found the one he wanted. The line rang once, twice. "Hey, Gramps," came Lily's voice, cheerful as ever. "What's up?" He smiled despite himself. "You home next week?" She laughed. "Oh no. What did they fine you for this time?" George didn't answer right away. He looked out across the yard, at the fence now glowing faintly in the lowering sun, at the flowers trying their best to break through the mulch he laid last weekend, at the quiet street he'd lived on since 1984. "You'll want to see it yourself," he said. As the sky dimmed, George grabbed his red carpenter's pencil and made a mark on his calendar beside the fridge. "Fence built," he scribbled, then added underneath in smaller letters, "HOA letter number 14. He put the pencil down, opened the cabinet under the sink, and pulled out a dusty folder labeled Correspondence, Harmless. The new letter went in front. That evening, Boone dozed at George's feet while the radio played Glenn Miller low and steady in the background. Outside, the wind carried the scent of pine and early lilacs, and somewhere in the distance, a child's bicycle bell rang, twice. George pets his hound, then mutters, "They picked the wrong man and the wrong fence." Lily's little electric hatchback hums up the driveway. She steps out in overalls dusted with clay, notebook in hand, and grins at the fence like it's a gallery piece. George was on the porch, as usual, flipping through the morning paper with Boone curled at his feet. The faint sound of tires on gravel made him glance up. The car, small and lime green, came to a quiet stop near the garage. Lily stepped out, pushed her sunglasses into her hair, and surveyed the fence like a critic at a sculpture unveiling. "You know," she said, approaching with slow, deliberate steps, "you accidentally made a sun prism." George snorted. "I made a fence. Accidents in the eye of the beholder." Lily laughed and dropped her duffel just inside the porch rail. She crouched to pet Boone, who stretched obligingly and thumped his tail against the wood. "Hey, old boy. Still guarding the kingdom?" George stood with a slight groan and handed her a folded sheet of paper. "Your kingdom's under siege," he said. "They're calling it a visual disruption." Lily scanned the letter, eyes narrowing at the HOA logo. Section 4B, she read aloud. "Inconsistent materials, reflective surfaces." She looked back at the fence. "They make it sound like you built a disco wall." "Just wood and bottles," George said. "That's what they can't stand. It isn't manufactured." Inside the house, the familiar scent of cedar mulch mingled with lemon oil and tomato seedlings by the back screen door. Lily set her bag by the old coat rack and stepped into the kitchen. The wood stove was dark, but the typewriter still occupied its sacred corner of the table, a sheet already loaded. "You're still using that thing?" she asked. George opened a tin of tea. "Been with me longer than the microwave. Speaking of which, what's the matter with it? Makes a clicking sound when it's off." "That's not normal," Lily said, smiling. "But probably fixable. You keeping track of all your rebellious appliances?" George poured hot water over 2 mugs, setting hers on a coaster shaped like a trout. She stirred it absently, eyes still fixed on the letter. Back on the porch, they sat in silence for a while, sipping tea. The wind lifted the edge of a tarp near the shed, revealing a stack of reclaimed lumber. Lily leaned forward, elbows on knees. "What if this is more than just a fence?" she asked. George raised an eyebrow. "It's 6 feet tall and keeps rabbits out. What more should it be? I mean, what if it's art? Unintentional maybe, but still something, expressive. Ecological. Personal." George tapped the rim of his mug. "You think that'll stop Margaret Cranley?" Lily stood and walked along the fence line, trailing her fingers over the wood, pausing at a bottleneck that caught the light. "I've read about exemptions," she said. "Things like community installations, environmental design projects. There are towns that call murals infrastructure." George followed her with his eyes, not moving. "You want to paint it?" "No. I want to register it." He leaned back in his chair, joints groaning in time with the wood. "If this turns into one of your art school escapades." "I graduated 5 years ago, Gramps." "You still mail me weird postcards from places with zip lines." "That was one time. And it was a ropes course." She grinned and pulled out her laptop from the canvas satchel by the door. "Let me just see what the town says." As she sat cross-legged on the living room rug, George shuffled into the kitchen and started rummaging through a drawer. He returned with a small hammer and a tape measure. "If I build you a storage shed for all this gadgetry," he said, "you'll handle the tech stuff." "Deal." The afternoon light shifted, spilling over the porch and into the living room where Lily tapped away. Outside, Mr. Baines wandered past the open gate holding a basket of lettuce. "Hey there," he called softly. George stepped off the porch. "That for sale?" or just kindness? Bit of both, Baines said, setting the basket on the step. And some news, Margaret's been seen pacing the sidewalk near Ron's again. She doesn't like the daffodils. They're wild. She says they're aggressive bloomers. He chuckled. Tell Lily she's got allies. George nodded toward the living room. She's in the command bunker. Baines gave a wave and shuffled off. George carried the lettuce to the kitchen, washed a few leaves, and returned to the porch with a sandwich of tomato and greens on toasted rye. Lily was still typing, her brow furrowed, a pencil stuck behind one ear. There's a grant, she said suddenly, eyes bright. Through the Oregon Arts Council. For installations that merge ecology and local culture. George chewed slowly. Sounds suspiciously legitimate. It is. And it fast-tracks community projects for review. You don't even need to be an artist. Just, intentional. I was trying to be useful. Lily spun the laptop toward him. So was the guy who built the world's first wind chime from cutlery. Art doesn't need permission, but it helps if you've got paperwork. The sky outside had gone orange behind the treetops. Boone huffed and stretched across the entryway, content in the smell of tea and soil. Lily sat on the floor with her laptop, eyes gleaming. Gramps, what if we don't fight the rule, we outrule it? George peers over his fence, watching Margaret walk her lapdog in pearls and orthopedic sneakers. She stops, glares, and jots something into her HOA-branded notebook. The dog, a puff of white fur with a bow clipped between its ears, lifted one leg in George's flower bed. George raised an eyebrow, then leaned on the fence post, watching as Margaret adjusted her clipboard. She didn't return the gaze, but her shoulders straightened just enough to acknowledge that she knew he was looking. Boone, lounging beneath the porch swing, let out a low huff. Easy, boy, George said softly. We're complying. Creatively. Inside, Lily crouched by the dining table, surrounded by a fan of papers, highlighters, and her humming laptop. The application for eco-art designation was nearly finished. She looked up as George entered, holding a piece of sanded wood in his hands. You still working on the plaque? She asked. He nodded, setting it on the table. Reclaimed redwood. Thought I'd etch the approval code when it comes through. Nothing fancy. I think the word for this, Lily said, tapping the screen, is malicious compliance. George pulled a folding chair from the wall and sat, stretching his legs with a creak of his knees. Don't know about malicious. But I'll comply them into a corner if that's what it takes. Across the street, Mr. Baines walked past with a paper sack of peaches. He nodded toward Margaret and her lapdog disappearing around the corner. That leash, he said, cost more than your truck. George smirked. Mine runs. Later that morning, Lily uploaded the final forms, clicking through the checklist until the digital confirmation flashed green, submitted, under initial review. She turned the screen toward George. He gave a short grunt of approval, then got up to fetch the red carpenter's pencil from its place above the fridge. April 28th, he murmured, and marked the date with a neat cross on the wall calendar. Below it, he added a note in small print, Art Defense filed. Outside, the porch had transformed into a headquarters. A folding table held a stack of flyers Lily designed, Art Lives Here, Eco-Integrity Through Craft. A small map of Maple Lane was tacked to the side of the cabin, with red pins stuck into locations neighbors had mentioned receiving citations. George had labeled them, wind chimes, birdhouse, curtain color, and, in one case, porch gnome, unsanctioned. Remind me to ask Eunice what gnome that was, he said, eyeing the list. As if summoned, Eunice appeared, her pink sun hat tilted precariously over her short white curls. She carried a plastic container wrapped in foil. Rhubarb pie, she announced. Still warm. Thought you could use reinforcements. George accepted it with both hands. Appreciate the artillery. She glanced at the fence. You know, they fined me $75 for having mismatched cushions on my swing. Said it disturbed seasonal harmony. I told them the only harmony I need is Ella Fitzgerald on a Sunday morning. Lily laughed and motioned toward the map. You just earned your own pin. Margaret showed up that afternoon. She marched up the porch steps without ceremony and held out a sealed envelope. Second notice, she said. Non-compliance unresolved. Further inaction will result in contractor intervention. George didn't take the envelope right away. You plan to bring someone in to tear it down? Only if we must, Margaret replied, her smile taut. Community harmony is non-negotiable. Lily stepped forward and took the envelope. Good thing we just submitted paperwork to the Oregon Arts Council. You may want to check state statutes before you authorize a backhoe. Margaret's gaze narrowed, but she said nothing. She turned, heels clicking down the steps, the lapdog trotting beside her. Boone barked once, more sigh than threat. The next morning, Lily opened her email with one eye still closed. A bold header glowed on the screen, provisional review approved, temporary artistic status confirmed. She shrieked loud enough to wake George, who shuffled into the kitchen in socks and undershirt. What is it? He asked, reaching for his coffee pot. Lily spun the laptop toward him. We're official. By noon, George had tacked a laminated copy of the approval letter onto the fence. The plaque now read, Registered Eco Art, Provisional #476A. Lily took photos with an old Polaroid she found in a drawer and stuck the developing prints to the fridge with Helen's old fruit magnets. Margaret passed by later that day, slower than usual. Her eyes scanned the plaque. Her mouth twisted, then straightened. Her pen came out. She didn't write anything, just tapped the notebook once against her thigh. Then, looking straight ahead, she muttered, let's see what the board thinks of this little performance. A padded envelope arrives in the Morning Post. Inside, an official letterhead from the Oregon Arts Council stamped provisional approval. George held it in both hands for a long moment, turning the envelope over like it might contain something fragile. The early sun hadn't yet burned the dew off the porch rail, and Boone was still curled on the welcome mat, twitching in his sleep. The street was quiet except for the squeaky rhythm of a neighbor's sprinkler spinning 2 houses down and the tinny voice of Patsy Cline drifting from a cracked kitchen window. He opened the envelope with his pocket knife. Inside was a single letter, thick stock, crisp type. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat and read it aloud. If installed with community intent and environmental design, he said slowly, your structure may be considered functional eco-art. Lily, already at the kitchen table with her tea and planner, looked up with wide eyes. That's it, she said. That's the clause. That's the loophole. It's not a loophole, George said, still staring at the letter. It's permission. She stood, took the page from his hand, and read it again with her lips pressed tight in a smile. Then she folded it carefully, laminated it between 2 clear sheets, and added a bold label at the bottom, Registered Eco Art, Provisional #476A. By mid-morning, George was out front with his hammer, attaching the plaque directly to the center post of the fence. It gleamed under the sun, framed by bottle glass and hand-hewn cedar. A pair of kids biked past on their way to school and slowed to look. One pointed, the other just nodded, as if it made perfect sense. On the porch, a row of folding chairs leaned against the railing. Lily had printed 6 flyers with bold type, Art belongs in all neighborhoods, and taped them to the porch posts. George had added a handwritten sign under the mailbox, curious? Sit and ask. At the Saturday farmers market, Lily set up a small booth between the jam table and a man selling wind chimes made from spoons. Her display board read, Art in Everyday Spaces, with photos of George's fence, along with a stack of pamphlets explaining the eco-art designation process. A few passers-by stopped to chat, including a middle-aged couple from the next street over who whispered, is it true she finds someone for planting marigolds? Back at the house, George sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea and a bowl of cherry tomatoes. The sun shifted, sending rainbow speckles across the porch floor as light passed through the bottles. Boone lay beside his chair, head resting on a cushion Helen had sewn from old quilting squares. Ron appeared late morning, hands in his pockets, eyes shaded under a mariner's cap. He paused near the fence, looked at the plaque, and gave a small nod. Looks good, he said. Didn't do it for looks, George replied. Ron stepped closer. No, but it helps. He scratched his jaw, then added, thanks for standing up. Most of us just gave up. George didn't say anything. He just reached down, grabbed a second lawn chair, and unfolded it beside his own. Not long after, Margaret arrived. Her blouse was pressed, her clipboard tucked under one arm, and her dog sported a new collar studded with rhinestones. She didn't step onto the porch. Instead, she stopped at the fence, peered at the plaque, and raised her eyebrows. Just because it's called art, she said, doesn't mean it belongs in a neighborhood. George didn't rise. I'm aware. But it doesn't mean it doesn't either. Margaret tapped the clipboard with her pen. The board hasn't reviewed this development. That's funny, George said. They sure didn't hesitate to send me a fine. I'd advise you to be careful. He gestured toward the flyer on the post. I'm being careful. Respectful, even. This is all within the rules. Margaret stared at the plaque for a moment longer, then reached out as if to remove it. Her fingers curled around the edge of the laminate. George stood in one motion, his hand landing gently but firmly on her wrist. Boone growled once, low and steady. This one's got teeth, George said calmly. Margaret's lips thinned into a tight line. She yanked her hand back, straightened her blouse, and turned on her heel. Emergency session, she called over her shoulder. The board meets Monday. Bright yellow flyers appear on every porch overnight. Emergency HOA session, May 1st, subject, neighborhood aesthetics and structural consistency. George found his pinned under the windshield wiper of his truck. He peeled it free with 2 fingers and held it up against the morning light. The paper was thick and slightly glossy, the kind used for yard sale signs or political promises. Boone sniffed at it and sneezed. Inside, Lily was already up, sleeves rolled and coffee mug in hand, poring over a mess of HOA newsletters. Got one too, she said without looking up. Ron said they were all over Maple Lane before sunrise. George laid the flyer on the kitchen counter next to a stack of Post-its and muttered, she's doubling down. Lily didn't respond immediately. She was scanning a line in a newsletter from last fall that warned residents against uncoordinated porch decor. She underlined it and scribbled a note beside it in cursive, knowing full well George ignored anything typed smaller than his reading glasses could tolerate. That afternoon, Mr. Baines shuffled over carrying a thick binder wrapped in a rubber band. You might want to read what Margaret didn't put online, he said, handing it over. George raised an eyebrow but accepted it. The binder creaked as he opened it. Inside were handwritten meeting notes, budget reports, and several memos that never made it into the public minutes. Maintenance consulting, George read aloud. $2 texture consistency in common areas. What in God's name is that? Lily peered over his shoulder. Padding. They've been disguising aesthetic spending as maintenance. Ron and Darla stopped by shortly after, drawn by the smell of tomato soup wafting from the open window. Ron offered to go through old budget emails. Darla took post-it duty, flagging anything that looked like duplication or vague expense descriptions. George had turned the porch into a command center. The folding table was now covered with highlighted excerpts, a map of the neighborhood with red dots where Margaret's citations had landed, and a thermos he'd owned since '82, green steel, dented but dependable. He sipped from it while Lily clicked through slide layouts on her laptop. We should open with the state approval letter, she said, then hit them with examples from other communities, mailbox art in Sedona, sculptural fencing in Eugene. George nodded. Then finish with the ledger. They worked late, pausing only to grill cheese sandwiches and eat them over the sink like fugitives from civility. Lily stuck another post-it on George's coffee mug, mention wind chime story. He read it, shook his head. Back in '09, he said aloud, Margaret tried to get Helen's chimes taken down. Said they disrupted sleep patterns. Never mind, they'd hung there since '84. Boone sighed and shifted under the table. The next morning, a crisp envelope slid through the mail slot. George bent to pick it up. The return address read, Willow Creek Homeowners Association, with Margaret's signature at the bottom corner. He opened it slowly. Inside was a letter, folded with surgical precision. He read it once, then again. HOA has engaged a licensed landscaping contractor to remove non-compliant structures on or after May 3rd, he said aloud. Lily stopped typing. They're going to tear it down. They're going to try. She grabbed the letter, scanned it, and muttered a few choice words under her breath. Then she looked at George. We still have the meeting. George stepped onto the porch and looked out across the yard. The sprinkler was running, its rhythmic click and spray catching beams of sunlight and scattering them in fleeting arcs across the grass. He didn't say much. Just crossed his arms and watched the water glisten. George watches the sprinkler catch sunlight and says to Lily, we better make May 1st count. The Willow Creek Community Center is standing room only. Folding chairs creak, fans spin overhead, and George's fence is projected onto a screen. George adjusted his collar as he stepped inside, nodding politely to a neighbor he only ever saw at leaf pickups. The air smelled faintly of powdered lemonade, old carpet, and anticipation. Near the door, someone had arranged trays of cookies and a large glass jug of cider, sweating under the fluorescent lights. The old bingo machine sat tucked in the corner, wires dangling out of the back like forgotten limbs. Eunice leaned toward Lily and whispered, last time it was this full, we were voting on whether to allow pumpkins on porches. Lily smiled, but her fingers stayed steady on the vintage clicker she held like a conductor's baton. She stood near the projector with a neatly stacked folder beside her, art designation paperwork, budget reports, and copies of the original HOA bylaws. George took a seat in the third row, just behind Mr. Baines, who was thumbing through his notes with quiet resolve. Boone was not permitted inside, but someone had tied a note to his collar outside, good dog. Back in 10. Margaret stood at the front, blazer starched to perfection, clipboard clasped tightly in both hands. Her smile was all teeth and no kindness. We are here today, she began, voice amplified slightly by a crackling mic, to address certain inconsistencies in our neighborhood's visual standards and the recent designation of non-regulated structures as, she paused, art. Lily stepped forward. With respect, the designation was issued by the Oregon Arts Council after a formal review. She clicked the first slide. The image of George's fence appeared on the screen, bottle glass shimmering under spring light, weathered wood fitted like a jigsaw of memories. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. This piece, Lily continued, qualifies as community-integrated eco-art. It is built entirely from repurposed materials. It reflects our town's values of sustainability, self-expression, and history. Margaret cleared her throat loudly. It's a splintered spectacle, she said, voice sharp. An eyesore masquerading as meaning. And it undermines years of coordinated design. Which design? Asked Mr. Langley from the back. The one that fined me for putting wind chimes on my eaves? That earned a chuckle from several rows. Margaret stiffened. This isn't about grudges. It's about standards. Mr. Baines stood slowly. He held up a binder, opened it to a flagged page, and read aloud, March budget entry, Zen gravel repositioning, $1,875. April, Moss Aesthetics review, $940. These were logged as maintenance. Gasps rippled through the hall. Someone near the cookies muttered, you've got to be kidding. Margaret flushed but kept her posture. Landscaping is essential to neighborhood harmony. And what about the 3 separate charges for porch line realignment all billed to the same contractor under different company names? Mr. Baines turned another page. This one's a cousin of yours, if I'm not mistaken. The tension snapped. A PTA mom near the front stood and said, you fine me for putting a blue umbrella in my yard. A man in a postal jacket added, you told my wife her curtains read as hostile. Voices rose, one after another, like the pop of corn in a skillet. Lily clicked through another slide showing eco-art examples from nearby towns. George sat quietly, arms folded, listening. Margaret banged her clipboard on the table. This isn't a democracy, it's an agreement. Someone in the front row raised their phone. "I've upheld order," Margaret continued, her voice climbing. "I've preserved value. Without me, this place becomes chaos." Her voice cracked on the last word. And then she turned, shoved the clipboard into her bag and stormed out. The doors clattered behind her. For a moment, the room was silent except for the soft squeak of the fans. Then the whispers returned, faster, sharper, excited. George stayed seated, folds of his flannel shirt still crisp where his arms crossed over his chest. His eyes followed the movement of light across the screen as it landed once more on the image of his fence. He said softly, not to anyone in particular, "It's finally starting." By morning, Margaret's HOA resignation letter has been posted on the community board, typed in bold, uppercase font, and underlined 3 times. George spotted it on his walk to the mailbox, pinned with a thumbtack that hadn't quite gone in straight. The paper fluttered in the breeze like it didn't quite believe it was supposed to stay. Board function suspended pending review. He stared at it for a moment, then chuckled under his breath and kept walking. Back on the porch, the air smelled of damp earth and lilacs. Rain had rolled through before dawn, and the drops still clung to the bottle tops on the fence, refracting tiny rainbows. Boone padded out from under the bench and nudged George's knee. "No papers today, boy," George said, scratching his ears. "Looks like peace broke out overnight." The porch was calm again. No post-it notes, no maps, no binders. Just a ceramic mug with cooling coffee and a folded flannel blanket over the rocker's arm. It had been a long few weeks, and George wasn't sure what he felt now, relief, maybe. Or just tired. Ron wandered by with a clipboard tucked under one arm. "You see it?" he asked, nodding toward the board. "I did," George said. Ron gave a small shrug. "It's strange seeing that board without her handwriting. Peaceful, but strange." Inside the house, Lily was at the kitchen table, her laptop open beside a half-eaten scone. The smell of cinnamon and lemon balm wafted through the room. She clicked something and grinned. "They replied," she said. "The State Registry Committee. They want documentation, photos, community statements, historical notes. They're considering full designation." George raised an eyebrow. "For the fence? For the whole idea? Community-integrated eco-expression?" She paused. "They said it was emblematic of resistance through preservation." He scratched his chin. "That's a lot of syllables for one fence." Outside, someone knocked gently at the gate. It was Mrs. Lang, the town historian, holding a leather-bound notebook and a tape recorder that looked older than George's thermos. "I'd like to record an interview," she said. "For the local archive. About the origin of the structure." George gestured toward the porch chairs. "There's space." Over the course of the morning, neighbors trickled by. Eunice brought lemon pie with graham cracker crust. Darla brought folding chairs and left them near the walkway. A teenager from 2 streets over dropped off a small bouquet of daisies and a hand-drawn sign that read, "Free fence equals free speech." Mr. Baines arrived last, carrying a jar of rhubarb jam and a folded piece of graph paper. "Drew this up myself," he said, handing the paper to George. "Some rough figures. Thought you could use it if the state comes asking." George unfolded it. It was a map of Maple Lane with every citation he'd recorded marked in pencil, wind chimes, porch plants, mailbox flags. But this time, each one was surrounded by a circle labeled community support. "They're calling it the free fence now," Baines added. "Heard it on the radio." Margaret didn't appear, but in the afternoon, a gray sedan pulled up quietly. A young woman stepped out, crisp pantsuit, expression tired but kind. She didn't come past the gate. Just stood there, arms crossed. George stepped down to greet her. Boone followed a few paces behind. "She never did know when to stop," the woman said quietly. George nodded once. "But she built something, even if it wasn't what she meant to." She left without another word. That evening, Lily printed the official document that had arrived in her inbox, recognized site, Community Eco Art, Willow Creek. She slid it into a frame and hung it beside the door, where the morning light would catch it just right. George pulled out a hand-drawn map he'd been working on and pinned it under the frame, every neighbor who had spoken up, every pie that had been dropped off, every shared story. He added a small red circle around the fence and labeled it Start Point. Rain ticked gently against the windows. The radio played a low hum of piano jazz. Boone stretched across the rug, snoring softly. Lily walked into the living room, hands on her hips, eyes scanning the wall. "You know," she said, "this space is kind of bare." George looked up. "It's always been that way." She tilted her head thoughtfully. Lily finds a blank wall in George's living room. "Let's make this your gallery, Gramps." A homemade sign hangs on George's front gate, Fence Freedom Day, potluck, music, story hour. The letters were painted in Lily's tidy hand, the colors cheerful, each word flanked by handprints from the neighborhood kids. Streamers hung between the maple trees, catching the warm breeze that carried smells of cinnamon bread, barbecue, and newly mown grass. Beneath the shade of George's porch, folding tables sagged with casserole dishes, pies, and mason jars of lemonade. Eunice arrived first, her sunflower pattern cushions tucked under one arm. She dropped them onto the porch swing with a grin. "I figured they're legal now." George laughed and gestured to the open lawn. "About time." Boone, wearing a red bandana Lily had embroidered with art dog, wandered between guests, accepting belly rubs and snack crumbs with veteran charm. Children darted past him, paintbrushes in hand, giggling as they added color to the Freedom Corner, a row of miniature fence planks set up for them to decorate. Lily stood near the old projector screen, now strung between two trees, adjusting the angle as the wind shifted. Her short film was cued and ready. George watched her from his chair under the porch awning, hands folded loosely, eyes soft. Neighbors milled about, some taking pictures beside the fence now festooned with ribbons, small signs, and faded photographs donated from drawers and albums all along Maple Lane. One frame held a picture of George and Helen, taken the year they moved in, him younger, but just as stubborn-looking, her laughing as she held up a paint-smeared trowel. Mrs. Lang jotted notes beside the refreshment table, where PTA moms passed out slices of apple pie and tiny paper flags labeled Fence Freedom Day 2023. A harmonica player near the rose bushes played softly, and somewhere behind the fence, someone began tuning a banjo. George stood as the murmurs died down and folks turned toward the porch. He cleared his throat, gaze sweeping the yard. "Some fences keep people out," he said. "Ours let them in." A pause. Then applause, not loud or rowdy, but full of warmth, the kind that came from shared understanding. Lily stepped forward and dimmed the lights under the porch awning. The screen flickered to life, and her short film began, soft narration, still photos, video clips of the community meeting, neighbors laughing, the sparkle of glass under spring rain. It ended with a slow pan across the finished fence, the words, "From Fence to Freedom," appearing across the bottom corner. When it was over, the audience clapped again, some teary, most smiling. Even Mr. Baines wiped at his eyes, though he blamed the pollen. He waited until the group quieted, then raised a hand. "Starting next week," he announced, "my front yard is getting a sculpture garden. Reclaimed birdhouses only." The crowd laughed and clapped again. In the middle of it all, a state official approached with a small wooden box in hand. She opened it to reveal a bronze plaque engraved with delicate serif lettering. "For community courage and creative protest," she read aloud, handing it to George. He took it with both hands, grip firm, jaw tight. He didn't say a word, but he nodded, and that was enough. Margaret was not present. No one mentioned her. As the sky deepened into shades of amber and mauve, the crowd settled onto picnic blankets, sipping cider and watching the stars arrive. Fireflies danced along the fence line. The casserole trays began to empty, and laughter echoed beneath the trees. Lily walked to the base of the fence and set down a small sign, laminated and clipped gently to the wood. At sunset, Lily sets down a final sign at the base of the fence, protected by history. Preserved by love.